Managing really hot franchises can be difficult for game publishers. When the sales start rolling in, there's always an initial knee-jerk reaction to start creating more games based on the license to make as much money as possible. The rub there is that the quality inevitably begins to suffer. Just look at poor old Mega Man. Namco has been smart with its Soul Calibur franchise thus far, only releasing standalone fighting games. But all that changes with Soul Calibur Legends for the Wii. Does this action-adventure set in the Soul Calibur universe continue the tradition of quality, or has this soul burnt out? Soul Calibur Legends is primarily about two blades, Soul Calibur and Soul Edge, that have thrust an entire civilization into war. Siegfried has Soul Edge, a magical weapon that has lost most of its power. Soul Calibur is in the hands of Barbaros, an evil sultan who wants to overrun the empire Siegfried's father died to protect. To save the empire, Siegfried must find and collect shards of Soul Edge that will restore its power, giving him the ability to defeat Barbaros. Along the way, he'll come into contact with some of the series' signature characters, all with their own motivation for wanting to help him. It's not a bad story, and it certainly provides you with enough incentive to keep on slogging through the combat. Considering the Soul Calibur mythos has been almost as confusing as Metal Gear Solid to this point, it also serves as a nice compendium, filling in some huge gaps and clarifying a lot of confusion. If you like a straightforward approach to video game design, then Legends certainly won't disappoint. 90% of the levels have no branching paths whatsoever, and you're forced to run a gauntlet where you have to kill every monster before magical barriers disappear, letting you move on. There are 7 different characters that eventually become unlocked as you play, and each has its own strengths and weaknesses. Siegfried, the main character, is slow yet powerful. Sophicia is quick and agile, yet her attacks are much weaker. The roster is filled out by stalwarts like Ivy, Mitsurugi, Astaroth, and several more, though undoubtedly one of your favorites didn't make the cut. You choose the level to play from a map screen and then choose 2 characters to take into battle. It's easy to swap between the 2 characters on the fly, and their specific talents come in handy depending on enemy type. As you complete missions, characters will level up, giving them new ranks and weapons. Then each armament can be leveled up individually. Repetition is certainly a part of the equation. You'll take on the same dozen or so enemies over and over and replay some of the same stages several times. The worst offenders are the defense missions, where you're asked to return to the Empire and repel Barbaros' attack under a strict time limit. These pop up far too frequently and never deviate from the same pattern. The single-player quest takes around 10 hours to complete, and there are offline cooperative and head-to-head options which give the game some staying power. Soul Calibur Legends is a Wii exclusive, so as you might imagine, the swordplay is all mapped to the remote. Outwardly, it may seem like the combat system is limited. This is only half true. There is actually quite a bit of depth to it, but accessing it is both difficult and relatively pointless. Sword swipes are handled with the Wii remote. Stab it forward, and the character will mimic the move. Swing it upwards, and they'll pull off an upward slash that will send the enemy flying to the sky, making them candidates for juggles. Likewise, if you swipe the remote to one side or another, the character will pull off a clearing strike. When you combine these options with the ability to strafe by pushing the nunchuck to each side and pull off counters, then you have the building blocks for a solid melee engine. The problem is that the gestures aren't always recognized. You really have to accentuate what you're doing for it to work, and when you're taking on half a dozen enemies at once, it isn't really an option. This is all right early on in the game when the enemies are sword fodder, but later on they'll be able to take you down with just a couple of blows, and the lack of response in the controls will force you to spam the jumping downward slash. This attack will basically get you through every traditional battle in the game, and it's a crutch that you will constantly lean on. The infrequent boss fights are a little different. These actually require some semblance of strategy, pattern memorization, and generous use of special attacks, which are governed by a meter at the top of the screen. These encounters are the one thing that will get you through the endless waves of enemies, and ultimately, to the end of the game. Another issue is the camera. You don't have any control over it whatsoever, which is generally fine if you're just going straight through a level, but attempt to circle back to pick up unused health, and it'll go into a conniption. It's also slow following the characters, resulting in surprises around some corners. The camera also adds to the difficulties with combat because it's impossible to keep track of all the enemies in any given scenario. Soul Calibur Legends has all the tools to make for an impressive action RPG, but the execution makes many of the features pointless. The combat system has some decent depth, but it's practically impossible to make use of it. The camera works fine as long as you're going in the direction the game thinks you should be. After a couple of hours, you'll learn to work around the limitations, which means you'll use the same attack over and over until the last enemy falls. For a series that initially built its reputation on stunning visuals, Soul Calibur Legends is an average-looking game. The majority of the polygon budget has been spent on the characters, resulting in smooth facial features and fairly articulate animation. The problem is that this has come at the expense of the rest of the game. Levels are basically barren tunnels with a barrel or two to hide health and special attack replenishing items. The enemies aren't much more convincing and look even worse when going through their choice of 2 or 3 animations. The bosses transcend the mediocrity and are undoubtedly the visual highlight of the game. The story is initially told through some fairly impressive cutscenes, but the longer you play the game, the more they give way to static art with plenty of text to read. The voice acting is generally strong, though some of the writing is laughable.
We will hold them off for 2 months with our very lives.
The music fits right in with the franchise's aesthetic, with booming orchestral pieces that complement the action nicely. Soul Calibur Legends isn't a particularly bad game, but it does absolutely nothing to separate itself from the piles of generic action games on the market. It can become oddly addicting, especially for fans of the franchise, but eventually, the repetition erodes the will to continue. There's some longevity in the form of offline multiplayer, but it's plagued by the same issues the single-player mode suffers from. If you're a fan, it's definitely at least worth a rent, but if you've sharpened your swords on games like Ninja Gaiden, then you're in for a lot of disappointment.